Hi, good morning, everyone. Let's now start with the next topic. So far, what we have seen is like how we can write down the test classes for a normal class, as well as how we can write down a test class for a batch class, for a trigger as well. Now, let me finish with two more things, and we are going to end up with this topic. How we can write down a test class, how we can create a test class, particularly for the future method as well as for the queuable interfaces. All right. So I'll quickly just come to the topic. So yeah, see, we have written this code long back when we were studying the use of the future method, and this was the code what we have written that time. And while explaining this thing to you guys, I have told you one thing about the mixed DML exception error. Now I'm giving you this command. You can unmute yourself. Can any one of you quickly tell me, uh, what is the cause of getting this mixed DML exception error? Yes, can any one of you quickly tell me what is the cost? What is the cause of getting this error? If you ever seeing this error, mixed DML exception, what is the reason of getting this error? I'm muting myself for just 1 minute. Meanwhile, think of it and just let me know the answer. If you are getting an error, an exception called mixed DML exception, what is the reason of seeing that exception? All right, so I guess any one of you, none of you rather, knows why we got this error. Anyways, maybe you guys are not studying or you haven't come to that topic. See, objects are of two types. I'm not talking about standard and the custom. When I'm saying that objects are two type, I'm actually referencing to setup and the non-setup object. So there are two types of objects, setup object as well as non-setup object. Setup object particularly are those objects which can directly interact with the Salesforce metadata. There are a lot of them, like user is one of them, permission set, profile, license, workflows. So there are a lot of those are kind of objects. Mostly they are all of them, not mostly, all of them are the standard objects, by the way, because no custom object cannot be a setup object. Setup object always have to be a standard object. There are a few of the setup objects, there are a few of the standard objects. Those can interact directly with the Salesforce metadata. So apart from that list, every other object, whether that is a standard or a custom, is considered to be a non-setup object. Now, if you wanted to have a detailed explanation of this, go with that session of future method. There I have explained this. In a very detail. Here, I would just try to summarize in one or two sentences, maybe. So, if you ever combine in a single transaction in a single program, if you ever combine a setup and non-setup object, that means if you are trying to perform a DML operation, that DML could be insert, update, delete, or any DML operation. If you are trying to perform in a single transaction, if you're trying to perform a DML operation, both on the setup as well as non-setup, in that case, Salesforce Apex Runtime Engine would throw you an error called makes DML exception. Makes DML exception. So that is the reason and the cause of getting this error, right? Go and revise this. I hope you would do that. All right. So how to avoid that mixed DML exception? We have studied something called as a future method. So future method did what? Whenever you create a future method inside in a normal program, if you create a method, if you would, first of all, the first thing was like, you have to bifurcate, you have to segregate, you have to differentiate the logic. The business logic you'll have to categorize into. I mean, you just would require to create two separate methods. Like as you can see, I have one method as called do DML operation, whereas I have another method called as create HR record. I have I have partitionized this whole operation into two separate methods. One, the one of them is doing operation on non-setup. Another one is doing the operation, whatever the DML operation it is committing that onto the setup object. Now, any one of them, it's up to your choice. There is no standard rule for that. There is no strict rule for that. Any one of them, you have to make it as a future method. So when you make a method as a future method, but there must be chaining, even though if your logic is segregated into two separate methods, there must be a chaining between them. So like you have one method called as create HR record. You are calling this method create HR record into inside in this method. So this method is calling this method, something like this. All right. So when you make a method as a future method, this whole logic, this whole business logic, that goes to Apex queue, that goes to Flex queue, and from Flex queue, it goes to Apex queue. And it is always this particular, only this portion, the method which is declared to be future, only that portion of the program is executed asynchronously. That portion of the program which is declared to be a future method, that method would execute, would always be executed asynchronously, right? So this is like, this is how, this is what as actually is the future method. Now, I'll quickly find out this program and I'll show you how to write down the test class, which is pretty simple thing. For queuable interface as well as for the future method, it's really simple. It's really simple to write down the test classes for them, right? I'll just try to find out that class, common help. So this was that method. This was that class we created, and we have discussed a lot, many things that time. Although I would recommend it if you just go back and revise this particular session so that you would know what is the purpose of a future method, what does it means by setup object, how many of them are there, or rather a few of examples of the setup object, non-setup object, and DML, XDML exception. So that everything I have explained in a very detailed manner. You just would require to take a quick revision of all those things. Anyways, I wanted to cover this class. I wanted to deploy this class, particularly from sandbox to production. And if I wanted to deploy this class, whether I mean, it's a normal class, it's a bash class, that does not matters anything, but you should at least have 75% of code coverage. All right. So if you would go and if you would try to see how much code coverage right now this class is presenting to us, so I'll go and I'll try to find out that class. I just have click on to Apex classes and I'll try to find out a class called as common helper class. Common helper, this one. Now, if you would see to the present code coverage, you can see it's 0% because we have not written any test class for this, right? So this is that class which is not covered right now. It does not have any code coverage and cannot be deployed to production environment. So I would quickly, I'll quickly create a class with name common helper test. Common helper test. Now I'll show you how we can write down the test class for uh, for a class where there is a future method. So I would be creating a test method, test, static test method, void, and let me give a name. Like test future method. You can give any relevant name. Now the single thing what is required over here, the single thing what is required over here is to just call this method. Nothing else. Nothing else. See, Although we have two separate methods, like you have one method called do DML operation, you have another method called create HR record. But if you would closely observe, you can see that create HR record is actually being called inside do DML. So what does this mean? This means while performing the execution of DML, do DML operation, this method, somewhere down in the time, runtime engine would see this, this statement. So after performing the execution of this whole statement, it would going to invoke this method. So it is something like, this would execute, this method would execute, and along inside in this method, as soon as this method is about to be ended, this method is getting called, right? So we just would require to call this, we just would require to call this. It is as simple as like this only. There's nothing else. So I'm going to call inside in the common helper, there is a method called do DML operation, right? I would just require to call it. That's it. Okay. Bus. And I would be saving this code. I would be saving this code. Oh, is the error? I haven't made this class. I haven't declared @test. Is test, right? Is test. Right. Now, like when time is to test it, just give me a moment. This zoom controls are not getting hidden automatically. I'll have to make a small changes in the settings. Show the zoom controls. Now it has been unchecked. All right. Now, see, if you would have seen, we can see that the present code coverage is 0% over here. I'm running this test now. I'm running this test. And now after running the test, let's see the outcome. You can see it from here as well. If you would refresh this, you will going to see the 100% code coverage. 100% code coverage, right? And you can even see it from here as well. Just try to drag it, go to test tab. Class name is common helper. I'm just clicking onto that class. You can see 100% code coverage. All of the statements of this has been covered. All of the statements of this has been covered, right? So it was as simple as like this. It was as simple as like this, right? So this is how you can provide the test coverages to the classes where you have used a future method inside in them, right? So that was as simple as like this. Let me quickly cover one more topic, which is about how we can write down the test class for QAble interfaces, right? Let me quickly cover, and that is going to be the last topic. Just a moment. All right. So let's now try to understand how you can create the test cases for QAble interfaces. Now, before going further with the QAble interface with this current topic, let me first of all try to quickly revise you a few of the things, the drawbacks related to the future method and why we have studied the QAble interfaces. So guys, see, future method is very promising. Future method is very promising. If you are facing the error, that exception, mixed DML, right? That time the future method is very promising because that's the only way you could get you could avoid that error mixed DML. You could avoid that error mixed DML exception. So future method is that only way by which I could differentiate between the DML operations on setup and non setup. But for other for other asynchronous operation, it certainly have a lot of drawbacks into it, right? It certainly have a lot of drawbacks into it. I'll just try to explain you a few of them. And to overcome all those difficulties with the future method, Salesforce has introduced inside in the Apex programming, Salesforce has introduced something called as queuable interfaces. Like if you talk about passing the parameters, if you talk about the passing the parameters, for example, you have created a method as a future method. I can see, if you can see this method, create HR record, this method, although is a future method, because it has been annotated with @future means this method is a future method. So if you are trying to pass on certain parameters, parameters are always passed inside in this, you know this. And you wanted to pass certain parameters over here. If this is a future method, the future method can only have primitive data type as a parameter. Like you can supply ID, integer, string, but you cannot give S object. You cannot give S object as a and I remember this perfectly that when I was discussing this, right? I have taken those examples even. I have shown you like what would happen if I would give any S object name, maybe account exam. I guess I have taken the name of account object that time. So what would happen if you would try to give S object as a parameter to a future method? So I have shown you all those things that time. You just would require to revise this session once more. So the very first drawback with the future method is like you cannot give S object as a parameter over here. Queuable interfaces allows you to give that. Well, if you are creating a queuable interface, right? If you're I mean, the queuable interfaces, you can give uh, S object as a parameter as well as primitive as a parameter. It allows you to give the both kinds of parameters. Then one future method cannot call another future method. There is no such thing called as chaining of future methods. Like one batch program can call another batch program. One batch class can call another batch class inside in the finish method. Because in the batch class, there are three methods: start, execute, and finish. Inside in the finish method, you can invoke another batch class. Inside in the finish method, you can invoke another batch class. So one batch class can call another batch class. Even one queuable interface can also call another queuable class. That is perfectly possible. But one future method cannot call another future method. There's no chaining mechanism, right? Then third thing what we have studied, if you remember when a batch execute, it creates an impression inside async apex job object. There is a standard object called async apex job. What would happen? What would happen when a batch class is executed? It would create a record. Automatically, a record is getting stored inside in this async apex job. So you can fire a query based on the batch job ID if you want. You can get the status of what has been happened to uh, that particular record. This can also be done with the queuable interfaces, but this cannot be done with the future methods. So there is only one way. If the future method is executed and you wanted to track the result, there's only one way to do that is to go in the user interface, is to go with the user interface and try to find it out over here. If I would create a job, right, and I would just click onto this Apex job, I can find out the status of all those future methods and everything. See, this was a batch class, although I haven't executed a future method, but this is the only way you could find out the status. But you cannot programmatically get it. You cannot fire the query on async apex job to get the status of what has been happened to the future method. You cannot do that because future method does not provide any traces. Future method does not provide any traces. It cannot be tracked. The results of a future method, the outcomes of the future method, the status of a future method cannot be tracked. Why? Unless you are onto the user interface. I'm not saying that it is impossible. Yes, it is possible, but with the help of user interface, you'll have to manually to navigate yourself to this particular page, right? You have to go to the jobs and Apex job. Here you have to find out what was the submitted date, status detail, and everything. But this is a manual process, and we are talking about programmatically getting this all things. So it's not possible, right? So these are mostly three known drawbacks with the future method. Future method does not accept S object as a parameter. Future method does not provide any tracking mechanism. Future method, one future method cannot call another future method. But all these drawbacks have been overcome with the queuable interfaces. So this we have studied, right? I was just trying to revise it quickly. Now, let me show you how you can write down a test class. Topic is not the topic which I am explaining right now is not future method, right? I am just trying to revise it quickly. How we can write down a test class for the queuable interfaces. So we have created a class with a name called hiring manager queuable. If I would go and I'll try to see how much code coverage presently this class is presenting. So the name of this class is hiring manager queuable. I'll go the list of H, hiring manager queuable. This class, you can see the present code coverage is 0%, right? Let's try to quickly write down the test class for this as well. So I am creating a new class with the name hiring manager queuable test, right? Inside in this, again, the same thing. See, I have told you that every test class must have at least one test method. You can have as many as you want, but it must at least have one test method, right? Give any name. Test queuable classes. You can give any name, whatever you think is appropriate. And now, how to write down? It is again pretty simple thing. I was about to ask you one question, but I don't think that is going to be worthy in your case. Actually, my question, which I was about to ask, how would you execute this class? This was one of my questions. Like yesterday, I have asked you, how would you execute a batch class, right? None of you have given me the answer for that. So I don't think that would be going to be a waste of time if I would ask you, how would you execute this method? How would you execute this class, right? So let me quickly come straightly to the answer. You would require, would require to invoke that method. You would require to invoke that method. By the way, there is an execute method only, right? Inside in your schedulable class and inside in your your queuable, there's only one execute method. And I'm giving you one more homework right now. Yeah, mujhe yaad aaya. Okay, the same, I mean, the logic which I would be creating over here, that also get applied, it's also get applied for the schedulable interfaces. So we also have created one schedulable class. I wanted you guys to write down the test class of that. Whatever the logic which I am creating right now over here, you can apply, you can create a similar kind of logic for schedulable interfaces as well. There's no changes in that, right? But I wanted you to do that, all right? So let me show you. So to write down the test class for a queuable interface, you would just require to invoke that. You would just require to invoke that like you just did over here, nothing else. But there is a little difference if you would remember this or not. The way the queuable classes, the queuable interfaces are being invoked, we have to follow the same. We have to follow the same pattern. Usually, I mean, when I was explaining this, I did whatever I did with the execute anonymous window, whatever I have written that time in the execute anonymous window, the same thing I have to write down over here. Same. Even for this as well, I did the same thing. You remember this or not? But if I wanted to invoke this class, this is what I have written in the execute anonymous window. This is what I have written. This is what I have written that time in the execute anonymous window. Now that statement which we have written, which I have written in the execute anonymous window, I'm writing the same statement inside in your test class. So there is no differences at all. There's no differences at all. All right. So that is what I would do over here. So how to invoke? You would require to first of all create. It's very simple. I'm saying it is same as you did this for a batch class. Yesterday, I guess we did that, right? How would you invoke a batch class? You first of all would create an object of that batch class. Now, similarly, how would you invoke a queuable class? You first of all would create an object of that queuable class. The same method what you did in yesterday itself. I'm creating a method of this. Equals to new class name, make it as a default constructor. Make it as a default constructor. What I just did, I have created an object of this class. The object name is char.queuable. Char.queuable. Now, you just would require to char.queuable.execute. That's it. That's it. And here you have to actually, this would require the queue context. right? So I'm not providing any context. I am just writing null. I would not be providing any context. I would just, because you have seen the execute method have one one parameter as context, right? System.queueable context. In case of batch, it is batchable dot context. Database dot batchable context. Over here, it is queueable context. But I would not, and inside in the, of course, inside in the schedulable program, it is system.schedulable context. Database.batchable context inside batch program. System.queueable context inside queueable interface. System.schedulable context in the schedulable class. We are not going to supply the value for that context, so I make it null. And now when I try to save this, it is going the error because again, I forgot to make this class as a test class. @ is test. Now let me try to save this. That's it. हो गया. बस इतना सही रहता है. All right. Now, if I would run this class, you can see the code coverage of hiring manager queueable, hiring managers queueable, hiring manager queueable. Now, as you can see, it's 100%, right? It is being covered 100%. You can see it from here. You can also see the same thing from the user interface. You can go to UI, and here, as if you would refresh this, we are going to see the latest code coverage, which is 100%. All right. So that was all about development. There's one more topic which is left, which you are going to study by your own. I have given you the entire material of Visual Force programming. Visual Force programming is an outdated interface, although there is no new development which is going on the Visual Force, but we are not sure where we are going to be landed. All right. So if you would have landed, if you have been tagged into a project where in the past some of the Visual Force interfaces have been created, now because of an ongoing maintenance activity, you are that person who is going to provide the support. So from that point of view, you must know Visual Force program. Otherwise, for all new development, wherever it is required to create a custom front-end user interface, that time we are using Lightning Pages, Lightning LWC particularly. All right. So LWC is the future, Visual Force is the past. But we cannot simply ignore this. You have to study this by your own. By tomorrow, I'm going to start with the last module from my end, from the Salesforce Classic part, which is integrations. And it would certainly require certain time. Probably 3 weeks. If the class goes regularly, it would require probably 3 or 2.5 weeks at least, not below to this, right? So by tomorrow, we are going to start with the integrations. That's all I have. Thank you so much. You have any question? Please go ahead. Yes, any questions? Anybody wanted to ask anything? Oh yeah, I wanted to discuss rather. Let me stop the recordings first of all.